All right. So we are at Disney or Touchstone Television at this point in the story. And you're really in the process of kind of inventing or reinventing this division of the company. Was there a sense of tradition at the company that you felt beholden to or that you felt was being imposed on you in any way?
No. It was a sort of Walt Disney, the history of Disney and the modern television business really had nothing to do with each other, thankfully. And Michael made a point of not imposing that on us. I'm sure, synergy was a big buzzword. I'm sure if we'd found really interesting things to do, they would have loved that. And if dinosaurs had been a huge hit, I'm sure there would have been dinosaur puppets in the parks. And there was always attempts made to figure out how to exploit any kind of intellectual property within the company from one division to the other. But there was no pressure put on us to come up with anything Disney in any way.
And on the flip side, was there any desire on the part of the buyers to buy something that was branded Disney? If like you were selling an 8 o'clock show, was that seen as a component of what it is that you were able to sell, or not at all?
Not at all. I mean, Disney had always been viewed as unhip by the buyers, and that never really changed. So nobody was particularly interested in the Walt Disney Company per se, and that was really the whole point. We had to earn our stripes, regardless of Disney history, regardless of how well we were doing, regardless of Michael's press. We had to get good writers and put on TV shows. I think that was the challenge, which I like to think we met.
So we've set the stage. They've given you some money to make some deals. You've made a Matt Williams deal. You've made the Michael Jacobs deal. You've got these Whit Thomas shows going. You said Dinosaurs was one of the first shows out of the box. Talk about sort of getting all the pieces aligned and then how that helped you to sort of rise up the ladder over there.
Well, it was clear that we were starting to have success. I mean, Dinosaurs was getting picked up for a second year. We were starting to sell shows. We went from 0 pilots or 1 pilot to 3, 4, 7, 10 pilots a year. So it was clearly working. And I developed a relationship with Jeffrey and with Michael. There was an increasing amount. I think people were feeling confident about the strategy that I had laid out and why it was important to do it, because it was showing signs of success. And they were promoting. I felt very much part of the Disney organization at that time. There was a real esprit de corps at Disney. The company was firing on all cylinders. Everybody was doing very well financially. It was a company that had a tremendous history, and so it was great to walk down Dopey Drive and to, if you have any feeling for that stuff, and I do, and to Walt's office and to walk through the administration building. So yeah, it was an exciting place to be. It was a company that was working in every single respect. It was the envy of the industry. Everybody wanted to be there.
It really sounds like the culture of the company was the antithesis of everything that you didn't like about NBC.
The culture of Disney that Michael, it had a golden moment, and I was fortunate enough to be there for a large part of it. And that golden moment was from 89 or 88 to 93 and 94, and it was really about. It was a very open culture. People, it's exactly the opposite of NBC. People were encouraged to disagree. To fight with each other. It was sort of like a Jewish Thanksgiving, It was like you'd have a meeting and guys would be screaming at each other across the table. And Michael would be screaming at somebody would be screaming at Michael, somebody would be screaming at Jeffrey. It was just a lot of yelling, but people were never discouraged from, in fact, people were encouraged to voice their passions for projects. And whoever voiced it most vigorously usually won. And even if Michael didn't like something, you could have an argument with him that ran for months. And you could win. And it was never personal. It was never, he disagrees with me, therefore I'm going to shoot him and he's an idiot, which was exactly the culture that Brandon created, sadly, at NBC, which is why they had so little creative success in their late periods, because that went on for a long, long, long time. Disney was exactly the opposite for a while. And it was great. We used to have gong shows. Jeffrey would literally take a gong And because we just we need to come up with some better ideas. Our ideas suck. 20 guys would go in a room, we'd pitch ideas, and they'd gong it. And then every once in a while, some idea would survive, and would kind of keep alive. But most of the time, very little came out of that. But it was just the culture was an exciting. It was creatively, it was in creative ferment, and that was great. And nobody was afraid of anybody, and that was also great. And people had an enormous autonomy because they seized it, and they liked it. Michael and Jeffrey and Frank liked it when people seized authority. They respected people who weren't well behaved, corporately well behaved, because they weren't corporately well behaved. That changed sadly over the years, but at the beginning, Disney was an unusual kind of buccaneer culture, and it suited me at the time.
Well, talk about, if you can, with some anecdotal illustration about sort of how you rose to that occasion.
Well, I'm just a personality that I'm a very, very direct. I'm a very direct person, and if I agree or disagree, I'll let you know. And at NBC, to take an example, if you disagreed, they didn't like that. They would literally come in. If you disagreed with Brandon at a public meeting, and this happened to a number of friends, the exec VP, now I don't know if it was Brandon who instituted that or just people, it's just the culture that got created by the people underneath him, but they would come and take you aside and say, you know what, don't do that. Don't disagree with Brandon publicly. If you spoke out of turn at NBC, they would come and talk to you and say, it's not your turn to speak. First, the executive vice president speaks, then the vice president speaks, and then if there's anything left over for you, then you speak. That's just another form of death, and Disney was exactly the opposite. It was like, if you have something to say, pipe up, Val, or if you don't say it, don't come back later. And so it was, for me, it was just, oh, that's great. I can say what I actually think. And I remember when my first week there or something, I was invited to a senior staff lunch, and it was a small group, like 8 or 9 people. It was Eisner and Katzenberg. My Randy Reese was my big boss at the time, or maybe it's like a couple months later after that, and Frank and Michael Eisner had come up with the idea of, he introduced the idea of, I got a great idea. We're going to buy. I'm talking to Kimmel Masters, and we're going to buy the Honeymooners is for sale. Meaning that, because CBS owns the Honeymooners, the underlying piece. And he said, we're going to buy the scripts and we're going to remake them.
The exact scripts.
Exact scripts. It's going to save money. Because Michael was always about saving money. So save money. We don't even have to redevelop the scripts. And I didn't say anything. And then he kept going. And I don't know. He must have caught I must have just rolled my eyes or something. And I didn't know at the time. And he said, who are you? And I said, and Randy said it was Dean Valentine. He's a director in the comedy development business. And he said, well, what? And he said, you don't think it's a good idea? And I said, no, it's like the fucking stupidest thing I've ever heard. And he was like this line. He said, why? And I said, Michael, it's the Honeymooners. You know what I mean? It's the Honeymooners. The Honeymooners is Jackie Gleason and Art Carney. So first of all, it's like saying, go find me Jackie Gleason and Art Carney. If there is no Jackie Gleason and Art Carney. You're just going to go find some fat guy and some thin guy and the Honeymooners? So that's the first thing. The second thing, these things were written 40 years ago. A completely different pacing, completely different jokes, completely different everything. And if you look at it, most of the comedy really comes out of Jackie's genius as a comedian, and the setups for that. It's the writers and the comedian working together to create something for him. So
teach somebody to do the Art Carney.
You can't just have these scripts and have some fat guy say the words and think that you have the Honeymooners. That's not the Honeymooners. And we got into this heated argument that went on for 10 minutes, and finally I could feel when Randy was kicking me under the table because I'd keep going like that, And but I was really into it. I was into the argument, and Michael was into the argument, and I knew he was into the argument, and it went on. Finally, it stopped and whatever. Went on with lunch, and afterward, Michael, when we were leaving, Michael was walking out. Michael came up and he put his arm and he said, "That was great," And so he enjoyed the combat, and I enjoyed the combat, you know.
What
So
a
it was
great way to get on the boss's radar.
Yeah, no, he did, and he, to this day he remembers those kinds of, fights that we had, over, he wanted to do he wanted to do a movie of the week. David Frost had sold him a movie of the week about Nadia Comaneci, who is the Romanian gymnast who had won the Olympics, and to me she was like, I'm Romanian. She by that point she'd already had done a whole lot of not very nice things, and really kind of collaborated with, the son of the Romanian dictator Ceausescu's son or whatever it was, and married him. So and I said, no, I'm not gonna develop that movie. And he said, well, yes you are. I made a deal with David Frost. I said, well, then you go shoot it, And this went on for I said, I'm not doing it. I said, it doesn't matter what you say to me. I'm not shooting the thing. You want to fire me, feel free. You want to hire somebody else to do it, you do it. But I'm not having anything to do with this thing. And this went on for months and months. And we never made it. And he had to finally call up David Frost and apologize and say that he had this little psycho working for him who refused to make it. And, but he remembers that to this day. And that's really what was great about Disney. So what was great about it was Michael at his very, very best when he had a best. And, and it was, and the whole company was like that. It wasn't, that tone seeped through everything, and it was great. It was incredibly enjoyable, and it led to a lot of really good work being done at a lot of different parts of the company.
Okay, so now you had been at this moment in time a director of comedy, what have you. Talk about then how this kind of activity, exposure, discourse led to your ascension.
Well, as I said, we were doing well. Garth Ancier had an interesting career at, and who was in many ways a very brilliant guy, had been brought in to be president of the TV division, and he and I didn't, not through any doing of mine, but he and I did not get along. I mean, he felt because I had these relationships and because these writers were really writers that I brought in and he felt very insecure about the whole thing, and he just started creating a lot of problems for me, and creating problems for me was creating problems for the division, and there came a point where he just decided he didn't want to have me there, that I was just too much of it was too difficult for him to manage the division the way he wanted to manage it with me there, and particularly since I'm not the most go along, get along kind of guy, it was difficult for him. And so the moment came where he decided that he wanted to fire me, and he went to Randy and then to Rich and to Jeffrey Katzenberg and said, he told me to sit in my office, that I was no longer authorized to have any contact with any writers or with any producers or with any agents outside, and that I should sit in my office, and which I did. And I went on for about a month, and then he, because he wanted to have all the conversations directly, it was just very bizarre. And then he went to Jeffrey and said, I really want, it's Dean or me. And Jeffrey said, well, have a nice trip. And it was really that simple. He was gone the next day. And at that point, it was just, it was my division. And
so at this point, were you made president of the division, or?
Yeah, or executive vice president, whatever it was. Yeah, but that was like the last guy.
Wow.
Who was ever. But yeah, he was. And in truth, it wasn't really his fault. I mean, he was put in it because what had happened is I'd already developed all these. He was put in a position where he had to overcome me in his mind to succeed at what he wanted to do and run it the way he wanted to run it. And that's just very difficult to do when you're brought in late and not given a clear mandate about what it is to be doing. So I'm not sure there would have been too many people would have felt differently. He dealt with it in not a particularly mature way, but. It was difficult for him. And,
well, for young executives or people who want to become executives in the entertainment industry, I mean, this is sort of an amazing moment in your history, an amazing crossroads that you found yourself at, and sitting in your office for a month, and I think dealing with this situation that would, I think, make a lot of people just go nuts. What is the sort of the lesson to be learned, you think, from this, the way this all played out?
Well, the lesson is to have books that you like a lot, because that month I brought War and Peace into the office, and I started on page 1, and by the time it was over, I was into the afterword, Tolstoy's Afterword, and it was it was a great experience. I got a lot positive out of it, and I don't, I think in terms of office politics and stuff like that, I think the best advice I can ever give anybody is to really not. I think Obama would be a perfect example of how to play the office politics game correctly, which is to be larger. If you're larger than the politics, you'll always win at the politics. And I think if you're smaller than it and you get involved in the fistfights and the street battles, you will continuously lose. It's not true for everybody. There's a lot of people who are, sort of thuggy type guys, but the guys who do it really, really well manage to stand above it and to see a larger vision of what is needed and to think about what's right for the company and, or the organization or the country. And the more you get involved in these kinds of things, the smaller you tend to look. But, obviously there's, you have to kind of gauge your own political situation. There's places where being a street thug probably works. I'm sure in the mafia, so the more, I guess the lesson is the more your company looks like the mafia, the more you should look like a street thug. But if it's not the mafia, if it's a corporation, you should probably try to stand above it and do the right thing. That's what I learned.
I think that's a fantastic soundbite right there. All right, so what year are we about here? Garth is leaving.
It's about like 90, 91, I don't know, somewhere in there.
Okay, so you are about to really hit a fantastic stride in terms of developing and selling some great shows. Let's start with Home Improvement. Let's talk about the development of Home Improvement and take me through sort of from the moment that process began to getting that show on the air.
Well, there are a number of streams that sort of poured into the river. I mean, the one of them was that Jeffrey and I had both gotten the tape of a comedian named Tim Allen, and both of us, Jeffrey responded to it and I responded to it, and we thought it was this kind of guy stuff was great, and so that was one stream. And he was a deal that was. We were trying to make it the same. We'd already just made the Matt deal. So that was sort of happening simultaneously. And I'd been reading, in my reading, I'd been reading Iron John, which was a book that had come out about the new man. And I read it mostly just as a cultural curiosity because it was making its way up the bestseller list and everything else. But it really struck me that Tim Allen thing and Iron John and this kind of that there was this sort of a wave of men trying to cope with women's liberation in a much more manly way. How do we stay guys?
Post Alan Alda masculinity.
Exactly, and that there was something culturally happening in this attempt to define what a contemporary male was, and comedy's always best when it has its feet in reality, and this is a reality, and so. I took Matt out to lunch and I pitched him, and because he's a pretty literate guy also, he's a playwright, and we started talking about it, and I pitched him. I can't remember which restaurant it was somewhere in Little Santa Monica, some Italian restaurants, and I pitched him an idea of doing a half hour that was really about a contemporary male, and about this guy that Jeffrey and I just made a deal with, Tim Allen, and would he meet with him, and he was interested. We spent a lot of time talking about philosophical stuff, and he was engaged. And a few weeks later, and Jeffrey was obviously involved in this as well. I view it more like in some ways as a partnership with Jeffrey in some ways, because even though I was driving the train, he was obviously he's a big wheel. And it meant a lot to people to have Jeffrey's approval, and to Matt especially wanted to be in the feature business, and to Tim Allen, and because Jeffrey controlled the feature gates, he had a lot of pull in any kind of deal that we made. So I used him as much as I could, and I set up a lunch with Matt and his agent, Rick Leeds at the time, and his manager, and and Tim, and his manager, and they started talking, and we pitched the idea, and they liked it, and Matt agreed to go and see Tim at his house, or I remember where Tim was living at the time, Minnesota or Pennsylvania, I don't remember where it was, and
Michigan.
Or Michigan, thank you, Michigan, and he went and spent like a week with him, and came back and he had the show. And that's really what it was, and he started writing it. I loved it from the beginning. I thought he really hit it, and he got it, he understood it. Matt himself was living a lot of this, and Tim was fantastic, and it was one of these. And ABC was very, very enthusiastic, which they would not keep to for very long. Their enthusiasm waxed and waned fairly heavily. But Stu Bloomberg was a big proponent of the project for a long period of time, and.
Now talk about the process, because Matt obviously had developed for and with talent very successfully.
Yes.
I mean, you talked about Roseanne. How collaborative was that process with he and Tim, or did he just sort of sit, absorb essence of Tim, see a show, and say, okay?
No,
cool,
it was very collaborative, but he was also very clear with Tim. Matt had a very unhappy experience with Roseanne, as you may remember. She fired him off his own show, and I make a deal, and it was very ugly, and she was. According to him, the worst experience of his life, and he was determined not to have that experience with talent. So he laid down the law, and we supported him early on about who was boss in this relationship, and that he would be as collaborative as Tim wanted to be, and he would include him as much as Tim wanted to be included. But he wasn't going to go through a Roseanne thing again. So there could only be one person running a show, and it was going to be him, and he kept to that. So Tim was respectful of that as well. And Tim had a very heavy hand in collaborating. A lot of his comedy was used in the script, and his voice was taken into the show and continued to be part of the show. But Matt was always the boss. And if he didn't want to listen to something, it was like, no, I'm not going to put that in there. And Tim was respectful of that. So it was a very good relationship, but it was post Roseanne, so Matt had a much better sense of how to deal with that and what he wanted. And Tim was coming off of not a lot of stand-up success, but he'd had drug issues, and he'd spent some time in a hoosegow that he had to reveal as part of that. And he was a chastened person in many ways, and I think partly because he was chastened made it a lot easier, and his ego was still on fairly small at that point. It made it a lot easier to make the process work because the egos weren't fighting each other that much. I'm sure it'd be a very different story for all of them now, but at the time it wasn't. So it was a very good collaboration. And when the couple of times where Tim managed to piss off Matt, and we spoke to him about it, he was almost near tears when we talked to him, because he really didn't. He knew that this was his chance. You don't get a lot of better chances than Matt Williams at that moment to have a TV show, and we did the show. It was the script was great. We cast it. We hired what was her name? Clint Eastwood's girlfriend.
Frances Fisher.
We hired Frances Fisher as the female lead, and the show was always structured really as a romantic comedy between husband and wife. That was that was the reason for its success and its charm, was that it wasn't really a family show. It was structured. It was done as a romantic comedy, and Frances Fisher it was about two equals. And as important as Tim was, the wife was actually absolutely 100% as important. And we did the table reading, and Frances Fisher was like really, she was good. And the show was funny, and people were laughing, and we knew we had a good show, but something just didn't feel right to me or to Bloomberg. And on run-through day, which is when we were rehearsing on Wednesday, the show was supposed to tape on Friday. We went through it, and Stuart and I were just talking afterward, and just said, man, it's too bad, because it's just she's a wonderful actress, but she's not really as funny as he is.
So this is before you shot the pilot?
This is as we're shooting the pilot.
Wow.
And this on stage for the pilot, and I said, we should take another shot at finding somebody. We got like 2 days. We should take a shot. And so we called Gene Blythe, who was my head of casting, and we said, it's just. He said, well, she's really good. And I said, she's believable. She's real. She wasn't born with the gift of comedy, and that just is something you're born with, or at least you develop it. You have to have it. It's not a rational thing, and the show will work even with her, but it won't be the same level of hit. And he said, I'll give one more try. And he went back to his office, and he had tried Pat Richardson before. She just had given birth to twins or something, and she really, and her husband Ray, who was also an actor, Ray, I can't remember, he didn't want her to go back to work, and he decided to try one more time, and he called her manager and said, it's a go pilot, we're going to recast, you don't have to do any work, it's in 2 days, and we'll pay you money, and you got to do it. And she finally talked her into coming in, and she came in the next day, and she read, and she was great. And we just said, that's it. And we sadly fired Francis, and we pushed the show back 2 days, so to Tuesday, and I think, and that was it. And it was magic. And when the two of them were together, it just, they had it. And so that was the story of Home Improvement.
So now, was the show a hit right out of the box?
Yes. I mean, I don't know, maybe like first or second episode, but it was a critical success, and it was a audience success right out of the box.
So
because it hit that moment of, it was a combination of the right moment and the right cast and the right everything, and the right writer.
So what do you think that as a show did for you, for your company, for ABC at that sort of moment in time in TV history?
Well, it made all three of us. ABC had really not had enormous success in the previous couple of years, and it really needed a hit show. It hadn't had one, and so it made them enormously, and all of a sudden they became the number one. I think they became the number one network as a result of Home Improvement, if I remember correctly. Disney became the hottest studio in town, and I became, the highest, highly regarded studio executive in town for a brief moment. Because that is with a hit. I didn't take it particularly seriously, but it was great, and I enjoyed it, it was phenomenal.
Now talk about how the show changed and evolved through its run.
Well, all shows change and evolve through their runs. You get worn out of, one character gets worn out, and they turn to another character. It became, over time, it became much more about the family. It was always a family show, but it really, the characters of the kids was much more rounded out. Tim's relationship with Al became much more of a buddy. The buddy comedy side of it was much more involved. I mean, Richard Karn was hired. There wasn't that much anticipation that he was going to be any big deal. He was just a guy who was helping him. And then there was something that happened on set, which was, I don't remember exactly what it was, but he gave a certain spin to, Richard gave a certain spin to a line. The line was, "That's right, Tim." And in the script, the way we'd always read the line when we read it was, "Yeah, that's right, Tim." It's like he's agreeing with him. But Richard kind of looked at him and said, "Yeah, that's right, Tim." So it's like all of a sudden you realize that Al thinks Tim is sort of like a half-wit most of the time. And he created this character and a relationship just in the way that he read that line that wasn't on the page. And as a result, really created, so a whole new character and relationship was created by the actor. And that created the buddy comedy, and that gave the show a lot of places to go as well, which it used. And so there were a lot of happy accidents that happened that let the show a lot. Physical comedy was always a little part of the show, but it became much, much bigger part of these huge stunts that they would set up and do of Tim falling through the roof or falling off a crane or whatever tool stunt they were doing. So it was the show really had enormous vitality for 4 or 5 years, and then sort of fell into the routine of most sitcoms. But it was great for a while.
Now talk about the scheduling of the show and how the network sort of used it strategically and how you and the producers regarded that.
Well, I'm trying to remember all the various scheduling things. I mean, ABC, ABC used it at first. I'm trying to remember what time period it was in first, but its first move was was up against Seinfeld, and it was really to try to blunt Seinfeld, which they'd had, which was I think ran at 9 o'clock, and I'd always been of the belief that Home Improvement was a 8 o'clock show, and ABC had. It was actually a problem to me. It was happening on all of network television, which is that there was a declining belief in the value of family viewing. And as the money was, the CPMs, the advertising money, was much better for shows that had a more concentrated 18 to 49 urban upscale demo. And those that usually meant adults, and adults watched at 9 o'clock. And so they that's the shows they were trying to do. Because NBC had success with those kinds of shows. And so ABC wanted a piece of that. ABC's strength had always been family, sort of middle America family viewing. Happy Days. You go back to the history of ABC, it was always this kind of middle American working class network. But a lot of that has to do with where its stations were and how it was grown as a network. But that's really what their core demographic was, their brand, whether they knew it or not. And the sad part was that they didn't know it. And so they kept chasing NBC. And what it meant for Home Improvement was that they took it from what was meant to be an 8 o'clock show that anchored at night to a 9 o'clock show where you lose the kids and the family audience. And I thought that was and it did well at 9 o'clock, but it really damaged the core show because all of a sudden you didn't have a whole generation of kids watching it and relating to it, And I thought it was and it's an argument I had with ABC for many years, for many, many years to come.
And the boys on Home Improvement had developed their own following.
Jonathan Taylor Thomas and especially their own following. So they were, and also what happens if you don't have strong shows at 8 o'clock in those days. I mean, obviously things have changed, but if you don't have strong shows at 8 o'clock, it's hard to get enough of an audience at 9 o'clock. It's a building thing. And if you look at NBC's traditional Thursday night at 8, that's really how it was. It was Cheers that was at 9. Cheers had no kids in it. It was an adult show, but it was Family Ties and Cosby that were at 8 and 8:30. And that's because it brought kids and families. Families could watch it together. You can make a lot of arguments. Families weren't watching things together. Kids were watching things in one room. But, the more you don't provide things for them to watch together, the more they're going to do that, obviously. So it was an argument that began with that at ABC. And for me, went on with them for the whole time that I was at Disney. And I thought it was a short-sighted move chasing dollars. I thought it was, and I think it damaged them. I think the damage continues actually to this. Now it doesn't matter anymore because the whole network is in such crisis. The whole network business is in such crisis. But I think the problem of destroying their 8 o'clock blocks and destroying their family viewing, I think is really what destroyed that network. And I don't think they ever fully recovered from it as a network. And it was, I think it was a decision made by Bob Iger and those guys, and it was a decision that was short-sighted, and it damaged Home Improvement. It damaged its ratings, but it still did great. And so it's hard. And they made a lot of money at it, but it was just a lot. First of all, for Disney, we certainly could have developed a lot of shows behind it. And developing a 9:30 show is very different than developing an 8:30 show. And we were never really built to develop 9:30 shows. I never liked those shows. It's not really consistent with Disney, and it's much harder for us to market it within the company. So as I sort of thought about what Disney's agenda was, developing 8:30 shows is much better for us. It's not that there was a Disney imperative. It's just that to market something like that within a company like Disney is much easier than to market something like, whatever, Night Court, if that was a 9:30 show, and so, that became an issue for me and ABC going forward for many, many years, with me and Iger and Ted Harbert, and Stu, but that's really what it was, and it started with Home Improvement and the move of it to 9 o'clock.
What do you think, just to put a fine point on Home Improvement, what do you think made it so popular over its run?
I think it was like all hit shows. I think it's some combination with what people were going through socially and psychologically, and then the quality of the elements of the show. I mean, it really takes both of them to happen. I think people's reevaluation of masculinity, the culture's reevaluation of masculinity, was the soil in which Home Improvement was born. And without that soil there, I don't think it would have grown. It was a time where guys were trying to figure out how to be men. And, you could think of it part of it as a reaction to feminism because, to the Alan Alda thing, which, women didn't like and guys didn't like that much either. But that was part of the reason that it was really huge. And the other part was Tim was phenomenally appealing, and the show was incredibly well written, very thoughtful, very humane, and I think it's a perfect television show in a lot of ways. It's exactly what you'd want to watch if you're watching television. Positive values, funny people, in a way that sort of says something substantive.
All right, moving on to some of the other, I think, significant shows during your time at Disney. Talk about the development and subsequently getting Ellen DeGeneres' show on the air.
Well, Ellen, God, that was a long story. She came out of a Marlins. Ellen came out of a Marlins and Black show. She was a minor character in a show that Neil Marlins and Carol Black had created. She was a secretary. I don't remember the name of the show, but we all saw her and we all loved her. She was like the wisecracking secretary, and we made a deal with her. And Marlins and Black wanted to write the show. And we had to deal with them too. And I had enormous respect for them. They were two of the more difficult humans I've ever worked with. And
I've just been handed a note. The show was called Open House.
Thank you very much. That's exactly right.
Nice one.
Very good. That show didn't work, but Ellen was clearly great, and I loved her. I've always loved her. I thought she was like a great comedian. She reminded me of sort of the early film comedians. There was something like very sort of Buster Keaton-ish or Laurel and Hardy about her, and there was just something that was really this kind of sort of anxiety and wonder about everything that she managed to convey. I just always thought she was great, and Neil and Carol wanted to do it, so we had great talent behind the camera. We had a great star, or somebody I thought would be a great star, and they were commissioned to do the show. And we sold it to ABC. They wrote it, and they wrote it as a ensemble comedy, and that was a mistake because she was the star, but they didn't want to write for a star because they didn't believe in the star system, and they didn't want any star telling them what to do because they had the whole same issue that Matt Williams did. And so the net result was they wrote an ensemble comedy for a woman who didn't want to be part of an ensemble comedy. She wanted to be the star. And then they were determined that whatever she wanted didn't really matter because what they wanted that mattered. So they did the show. It was a very funny pilot. There were some amazing, great scenes in it. People liked a large part of it, but it clearly didn't work. And whether it worked or not was really irrelevant because the star wasn't willing to participate. So fights started. The show made it on air. Fights between them started immediately. And
now, it made it on air, though, still with the ensemble conceit?
We're still with the ensemble conceit, and literally not a moment. There was no break. It was war from day one between them and Ellen, and and it didn't get better. It got worse and worse and worse and worse. And people, the audience, meanwhile, clearly loved her. They didn't care about the ensemble. So it was a problem. And, the ultimate way that I dealt with the problem was the way that I looked at what I thought was the most important element of this particular conflict. Because it was clear that there was no way we tried putting them together. We basically had mass therapy sessions. None of it worked. And not because any of them were bad people. They just had very different understanding of what they wanted to accomplish in life and what they were willing to tolerate. And we finally, it was clear they weren't going to work. And, Neil and Carol had to go, just because Ellen was the star. That's what the audience was responding to. And there was no way to back them because there was nothing to back. And I fired them. It was very difficult and very unpleasant because I had an enormous amount of affection for both of them. We brought in different writers and showrunners and started shifting the show to make it about Ellen. And Jolie Fisher was clearly working well in the relationship with her. There were good elements to the show, and we turned it much more to the Ellen DeGeneres show, and that's what it became.
So
that was phase one of the show.
So talk about the various phases of the show.
Well, there's a phase one, phase two, and then the famous phase three.
We'll build up to the famous phase three, but
phase two worked adequately, and the show was a good show. It never, for whatever reason, it never lifted off the ground. The show was never as good as she was. It always felt like this kind of talent was being trapped in a very traditional kind of TV show, and it never felt right.
Were you trying to change the venue? Were you trying to change?
Yeah, we changed the venue. We made a coffee shop. We made it much more about her. We made it much more about stories about her. Put her in situations where she could display her comedic talents, which were that sort of discomfort and anxiety. It was built much more as a vehicle, but for whatever set of reasons, I don't think we ever quite found the key to making it amazing. And it just became a pretty good television show with a funny lead. And the ratings reflected that. It did okay, but it never became a huge hit. It was a modest success at best.
So then let's talk about the much celebrated phase three.
Yeah, well, I think because the show had never really taken off, there was a kind of a underlying disquiet, and why hasn't, and I think in Ellen's mind, that sort of flowed with where she was politically and in terms of her own personal life, and she really came to feel that she needed to do something big for the show, and she needed to do something big in her own life that she couldn't.
So those two things were converging simultaneously.
I'm speculating to some extent, but I think they were converging simultaneously, and that was my sense of it at the time. And as a result, I think it resulted in the day when she called me up and said, "Can I come in and talk to you?" And I said, "Sure." And she came into my office and the fourth floor of the Disney building, and she said, at the beginning of the summer, she said, "I want to come out on the TV show. I want my character to come out." And I said, "Well, that'll be interesting." And we talked about it for some length. So I didn't commit at the time because I knew it's hard to look back now and think about what a big deal it was, because it all seems like such a joke that we could all think it was such a big deal then, but it was a big, big deal. And particularly for the Walt Disney Company to be involved in that was a big, big deal. And I understood that from the moment she said that.
Yeah, what's the first phone call you make when she leaves your office?
Well, the first phone call was to Michael, and saying, I gotta come and talk to you. And Michael's response was, "No way," and I felt differently about it. I thought, I took a day or two and I thought about it, and I wound up feeling differently about it. I thought that, first of all, that it was good for the show, because I didn't know where the show was going. We couldn't find the heartbeat of the show. Hadn't succeeded yet. Something had to be done, otherwise it was just going to peter out this year and go away. So I felt just from a showmanship standpoint, there would be something needed to happen, so that was good. And then just personally, I just felt that it was right, and I felt that it was right for her, that she needed to do it to continue to perform, and that if we didn't do it, there would be no Ellen, basically. That she had crossed the river. She was on the other side now, and she wasn't coming back. And there was nothing that you could say other than okay, or you're fired. And those are the two things you could really say. There wasn't anything like, well, we're just going to keep doing the show. It just didn't seem possible to me. And so I decided that I would support her and doing it, and I thought it was the right thing to do. And I told her that I would, and I told Michael. I said, no, you know.
And what about the network?
The network was next, and they were, they weren't supportive. They were. I mean, Stewart was, you know, Bloomberg, and you know, I mean, they were politically supportive. You know, that kind of, which is easy for anybody to be because after all, who wants to beat up on lesbians? You know what I mean? But they weren't really supportive. They didn't want to do it. They were worried about the public controversy. You know, they're very, very resistant, and which is not really surprising if you sort of think about where networks have been traditionally in these kinds of issues. They don't want the problems with advertisers, and they're worried about their advertisers. And it's hard to blame them. They had reason to worry about their advertisers. So they didn't want to do it. And, you know, it just led to months of negotiating. I won't say negotiate, there's nothing to negotiate ultimately. But I kept driving it forward, and Ellen kept driving it forward, because I think the same thing that became clear to me became clear to everybody else, which is that there was only two choices. You could do the show that Ellen wanted to do, or you could fire Ellen and shut down the show. There wasn't going to be putting anything. The toothpaste wasn't going back into the tube. And
well, I remember that episode being so anticipated. Like, we all sort of were aware that it was coming, and I remember her very slyly making allusions to the fact that it was coming. I mean, I remember one episode where she literally stepped into a closet and stepped out and said, "Oh, I'm in, I'm out."
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
you know, shtick like that. But talk about now actually making what became known as the puppy episode.
Yeah, well, you know, the once we decided that we were going to do it and everybody was more or less on board, you know, we didn't want to confirm it to anybody because we didn't want to go through months of just having to deal with the press issues on it. So just being able to say we can't confirm or deny anything was a much easier thing to say than yes, we're doing it, even though it becomes something of an open secret. You know, when they finally did it, we talked about it, we talked about what happened, and wrote the script, and I loved the script that they wrote. I thought it was charming and funny and great, and I thought that Middle America would absolutely embrace it, because it was like, you know, I mean, everybody, so many people in this country have had kids or relatives who've come out of the closet. You know, it's not like it's only happened to a bunch of urban elite people in Los Angeles and New York. This is something that everybody in Middle America has lived through, and I thought it was incredibly relatable, and I didn't think there'd be any problem. And I never thought, for Ellen, that she was unrelatable to Middle America. You know, in fact, just the opposite. I thought Middle America got her instinctively and would love her, and I thought the script was great. And we started doing it, and there were a lot of. You know, I kept getting death threats on my answering machine at the office. You know, just weird kind of things like, you know, kind of Jew boy, you know, we're going to kill you. You know, there were all these wackos out there, you know, and Ellen, I think, was getting threatening stuff, and you know, I had to have for a while I had to hire. We hired security guards outside my house in Beverly Hills. You know, there were people who were, it was scary for a lot of people, and even on the Wednesday where we did the run through of the show, you know, we had to clear it because it was a bomb threat, and right in the 2/3 of the way through, so we had to clear the stage. Somebody phoned in a bomb threat. So you know, there was a lot of, by this point it had become part of the culture wars in the United States, I think, and. You know, which is not something that I anticipated or really had thought about when we first embarked on this. I don't think Ellen did either, to be honest with you. But I will say that the run-through was amazing. And that moment where we first saw the show and she comes out, I mean, it was, you know, it was just it was a devastating moment. I mean, it was great. I mean, everybody, we realized, I think everybody on that set, and that it was at the run through, not at the at the ultimate production. It was great too, but it wasn't the same thing. But at the run through was the first time, if you sort of think about it, that had ever happened anywhere, and where she kissed, and Ellen started crying, and the producer started crying. It was a very moving moment for me as well, and it was great. We really felt that some special thing had been accomplished, or a line had been crossed that was important to cross. And for me, just personally, it was great because I have a lot of friends who are gay. I'm involved in the art world a lot. I collect contemporary art. Many artists are gay or lesbian, and it always, that kind of discrimination just outraged me, and on a personal level, it just really infuriated me. As it did Eisner, by the way, too. I mean, Disney had always been at the forefront of, pro-gay, the pro-gay movement, and as a company, it had always been very, very supportive of gay issues, and equal treatment, and so and a lot of my friends were calling me from New York, artists who were like, they were so excited, that this was going to happen, so it was great, and so it was great that it happened, and I was very pleased to be part of it. The night that it happened was like it was a big celebration. I knew as well that I have to say that once it happened, that it was also the death of the show, and it's not something that I ever admitted to anybody, and I certainly didn't make that argument to the network. But I knew that once you go down this path, there's really nowhere to go with it from a storytelling point of view, unless you're going to do stories that are really only going to appeal to gay people. Because from a broad standpoint, a show about lesbians is about lesbian dating and about trying to find a partner. And I just thought it was going to be a very, very difficult thing for America to swallow at this point, and particularly for a broad American audience to swallow at this point. And they didn't. And the show went on for another year, so it did give it enough life for one more year to get us into syndication and to get a sale out of it, which was really what I was charged with doing, and maybe even a little longer. But creatively, it was its high point, and it never managed to find what it was, because they kept trying to run away from the core of what it had to be. And there was no way to maybe if they'd really kind of gone after what it had to be, but I think that would have been very, very difficult for people to swallow at that point. That's really that's a cable show that could live off of a couple million people watching, but something that required 15, 20, 25 million people watching from middle America at that point, I don't think they were ready for that. So the show died, but it died gloriously, I have to say. And I was proud to be a part of it.
All right, well, we want to talk a little bit more about the corporate life at Disney, and then you want to get into UPN fairly quickly. Let's talk about the Disney-ABC merger in 1995, the effect that had on you and on television in general.
Well, it was clear by that point that there was going to be these mergers, and that studios and networks were going to merge. Studios needed distribution needed production. The government had repealed the FinCEN rules, which was one of the many things we can thank Bill Clinton for, and which I thought was going to lead to a disaster. And I think it sort of has at some level. But at any rate, it really made the merger of networks and studios inevitable. And so it wasn't as though I was surprised. And I always knew Michael wanted ABC. It's where he had grown up. It was his home. He had a relationship with Tom, with Murphy, and with Burke. He felt comfortable with them, and he felt comfortable with ABC. And so he'd been chasing this thing for some time, for a year and a half. And it was finally announced. I thought it was a bad idea from any number of perspectives. I didn't think we were. I thought the management at ABC was, with Murphy and Burke having reached the age where they're going to retire, I thought ABC had no management of any note for the company. I didn't think Disney had the ability at that point either to manage ABC. I thought, I thought it was going to be incredibly complicated to run a studio and a network at the same time and do it well, because they had different financial imperatives. And I wasn't sure that when you did the math finally, in terms of how it all paired out, that it was going to be worthwhile from the studio standpoint, which is really what I was charged with. So I was not a big supporter of it. But on the other hand, as I said, I think these things were somewhat inevitable given what was happening on Wall Street and given where the economy was and what was happening in the infrastructure of the entertainment business. So they did the deal, and it really, from that point on, it was from a network standpoint, it was incredibly problematic for all the reasons you would expect it to be problematic, which is who's really in charge, who's really making the decision. Is it the studio? Is it about what's developed? Is it the studio? Is it the network? Yeah, do we support ABC before we go CBS? If we have a show that CBS wants, so we have to show it to ABC.
What happens to your relationships with all the other buyers?
It gets hurt, and it's sort of inevitable that it did, and it does, and it just creates problems with ABC as well, because now they're you and you're them, but they're not really you and you're not really them, and it creates blurred lines of authority. And does Michael Eisner have to resolve all these things? And if it's not Michael Eisner, who is it? And it created a managerial mess and a really unpleasant environment from that standpoint. The positive side of that for me was that ABC's Saturday morning, Michael had asked me to just before we bought ABC. Michael had asked me to take a look at to take over the Disney animation division and TV animation, and it was really much more of a clean it up and put sheets on the furniture and just get rid of it and shut it down, because the division had really kind of worn out its welcome and the shows had died and he didn't want to spend any more money doing that kind of stuff, and I so I'd taken it on. It seemed like a fine thing to be doing, but what had happened is I'd fallen in love with animation, and I'd started giving money to the animators there to make their own little projects and to do stuff, and I'd gotten really excited about it. In fact, that's where I was spending all my time. I'd go down to Lancashire and I found myself no longer, I just wasn't going to my network TV job anymore. I was spending all my time in the animation building, and we took over ABC. That was great because now we had distribution for Saturday morning. There was a big block of time where you could produce stuff for, and they had no success on Saturday morning. So I wound up de facto with a revived budget and a revived thing, and that was incredible. And that's really what kept me going at Disney from 95 to 97 or 98 when I left, because I'd really completely lost it because of the difficulty of what was happening on the network side. And all the craziness and the politics, and by this point Michael Ovitz had come on board, and he had brought in Jamie Tarsis, and it became like a classic Hollywood, Baroque soap opera, insane absurdist comedy, and I really didn't want to be part of it anymore. And frankly, I would have, had it not been for the animation division, I would have quit because I just didn't want to be there anymore, and I didn't want to have anything to do with network television, and I didn't want to go to those meetings anymore. And but that gave me a place to go, and it was fantastic. I mean, it's actually the best time I've had in the entertainment industry were those 2 years of doing television, of doing animation, and I basically abandoned. To be perfectly honest, I abandoned my network television job at that point, and. It was whatever. It was fine, and I stopped getting involved in it, and I spent all my time doing, working with animators.
Do we need to break tape?